Hello, hi everybody. Again, I'm Emily Ramshaw. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the 19th. We are a national nonprofit newsroom at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. And I am really thrilled to be leading this conversation today with Sally Susman, the Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Pfizer. And our conversation today is really on the high stakes of communications and on Sally's incredible new book, which I think you all have. I can see it in some of your laps. It's called Breaking Through. So please join me in welcoming Sally.
Thank you.
So before Sally joined Pfizer in 2007, she held roles at the Estee Lauder companies and American Express. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a graduate of Connecticut College, and she studied at the London School of Economics. Sally is also the vice chair of the Pfizer Foundation, and she was recognized by Forbes as one of the world's most influential CMOs in 2022, and by LinkedIn as a 2019 top voice. Breaking Through is her very first book, and hopefully not her last. So Sally, I want to jump right in. We are living, obviously, in unprecedented times, and for leaders, in many ways, in stormy times. A global pandemic, an up and down economy, geopolitical tension, a war, and an America really deeply divided politically, but also on sort of what constitutes truth and what constitutes fact. I'd like to ask you sort of, why is the skill of communications so important to all of us? What is the role that it plays?
For sure. I'd love to answer your question, but I just first want to thank you for having me, thank Real Chemistry for having me, and say how much I admire what you do.
Thank you.
I've learned a bit about your program, and it's really very, very meaningful and relevant.
Thanks, Sally.
So, communications, often considered a soft skill, something nice to do. And over the course of nearly 4 decades in working in business and government and politics, civil society issues, I've come to believe deeply that communications is not a soft skill, but a rock-hard competency, and one that is increasingly relevant and important and necessary to any leader, not just to people who practice in the field, but to any leader who wants to open minds, move hearts, and change the world. And so I am on a crusade to make this point, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it with you today.
Well, I'm going to have you give us some pretty crystal clear examples of this today, and I'd like to start by framing this through the lens of a recent example, your experience navigating the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Pfizer had to make some really tough decisions on how to engage. You had a moral and a human rights responsibility, both to people who live globally. You had a corporate responsibility to U.S. consumers who were expecting you to take a stand. Talk a little bit about what that calculus was. What were the decisions you all had to make, and how did you make them?
Well, making decisions about fast-moving events is one of the most exciting and rewarding parts of this kind of work. In fact, when people sometimes ask me to please tell them what's an average day like, that is the one question I can't answer, because there is no average day. We're constantly reacting and acting based on what's happening in the news. So it was just about a year ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, and what we saw across the news was all kinds of leading companies, McDonald's, Coke, many consumer companies in particular, deciding that the right thing to do was to completely pull out of Russia.
Right.
Now, if you're in the medicine business or in a essential healthcare business, you have a humanitarian exemption. And so you are not expected to do those things. And of course, that makes perfect sense, right? Because a kid who lives in Russia with cancer is a kid with cancer, and deserves and needs and must have the same access to healthcare as any kid anywhere. But we didn't feel comfortable to just sort of rest on our laurel or sit in a business as usual position, and we certainly didn't want to be seen as profiting from what was happening in Russia. So at the same time that we made our decision to stay, we also decided that for as long as these hostilities continued, that we would donate every penny that we earned to Ukrainian relief efforts. And thank you. The only thing I wanted to add is I learned two things from this. One was there is often a creative solution to a problem and not a yes or no answer on high stakes, complex issues. The other, though, was it wasn't only important to do it, it was important to communicate this kind of complex answer. And so my CEO, Albert Bourla, that day went on Morning Joe and talked about it because we have a need to bring the public along with our decision making.
Sally, I want to step back a little bit. You've had a career that has spanned government, several senior positions at multinational corporations. Talk a little bit about the journey.
The journey, okay. So when I was a kid, and I suspect when most of us were kids, I wanted to do good in the world. I wanted to leave the campsite better than I found it and try to do something productive and good. And so I began my career in government. After I graduated from college, I started on Capitol Hill in the mailroom of a senator from my hometown in St. Louis. And I spent 6 years on Capitol Hill, and then I also went back briefly during the Clinton administration. And I found government really frustrating and pretty bureaucratic and slow. And my one accomplishment while working on Capitol Hill was drafting a piece of legislation in which I changed an or to an and. And as lawyers in the room will know, that can be meaningful, but it wasn't entirely satisfactory. It didn't, rev my engines. And so I developed a theory in my mind that if you go to a good, purpose-driven, successful, forward-leaning company, you could find some platforms and avenues for good. And so I started American Express. We did some work on consumer literacy. I spent several years with the Estee Lauder companies and was able to help with breast cancer research. And then I made my way to Pfizer 15 years ago, and I think we'll probably talk more about what happened there.
We will. So you have worked for 9 CEOs over the course of your career, and you write in your book that sincerity, an outer-directed spirit, and an ego kept in check is what makes for the most admirable, persuasive leader and communicator. I'd like you to think back on those 9 CEOs and give an example. Pick one and tell us how that one person personified those traits.
I'm happy to, and it was a great experience and learning experience to work with those 9 CEOs. They all did good things in their own way, but as you say, Emily, the point is that those that were breakthrough communicators were able to really be visionary and, wonderfully special CEOs. The one that comes to mind is from my time at American Express. Some of you may know the name Ken Chenault, who was the CEO there for many, many years. But he was a new CEO when 9/11 happened. And he'd just become CEO of American Express. Obviously, the economy, the global economy, took a big hit when that happened. Their headquarters was right down at Ground Zero and closed. He was on a business trip and couldn't get back to New York. And he decided that what he would do is get back to New York and invite the employees of American Express to an all-colleague event at Madison Square Garden. And what he did there is he tore up the speech that had been written for him. He spoke from his heart. He said that, he felt the pain of the loss and the fear, that he expressed his confidence that American Express's best days were ahead of them. And it was a conversation really heard around the world in business at that time. And so I talk about Ken in the book in the chapter on pitch because it was pitch perfect.
Is there a moment in your own career where you felt like you were exactly pitch perfect?
There are many more moments where I feel I was not pitch perfect. But we don't need to dig into those right now. Not a good idea.
I might ask you about a couple of them later, so we'll
Okay.
get there. Yeah. I want to talk about the growing responsibility, and some might call it pressure, that companies feel to engage on social issues these days, to weigh in on major headlines. And honestly, sometimes y'all are asked by those of us in the media to take a stand on things. I'm certain this has only grown over the course of your career. Can you tell us a little bit on how you decide what issues you're going to weigh in on and what issues you're going to say, you know what, Pfizer's going to take a pass on this?
Yes, and it is a question that I have to answer a lot, and one, as you say, Emily, with growing frequency as more and more issues are in the fore. There's a kind of a stakeholder mentality out there, whether people are environmentalists or patient advocates. There's a lot of pressures coming down on companies today. And at Pfizer is a very metric-driven company. So we have a metric for everything. Should we invest money in this? Should this advance through the pipeline? But we had no metric for whether or not we should engage in any public issues. So I decided we needed one, and about 8 years ago, came up with a framework to decide this question. And it's a simple framework. It has 5 questions. So the first question is, does this issue relate to our purpose? Because there are many important issues like deforestation, which is a critical issue, but has really nothing to do with Pfizer's purpose, breakthroughs that change patients' lives. And I felt that if we spoke out on every issue, you lose your agency, and people are like, oh, it's just them again. The second question is, how does it impact our stakeholders? And the stakeholders, as I said, they can be patients, regulators, government officials, but there is no stakeholder more important than our employees. And I always feel that is stakeholder number 1. The third question we ask is, how does this impact our values? So Pfizer has 4 values: courage, excellence, equity, and joy. And if the issues, so for example, when George Floyd was murdered, it may not be related to our purpose, but if you have a value of equity, you must speak out when racism occurs. The fourth question is, what are our options for engaging? Because as you say, and as you know, as a journalist, it isn't just the reporter calling on deadline who gives you 30 minutes to come up with an answer, or someone who's pushing a petition in your face and say, sign my petition. But companies like people can express themselves in their own words, in their own ways, in their own time. So often I like to have our CEO send a letter to our colleagues, and then we post it on our website. So you're making it a proactive thing and not a reactive thing. And then the last question I always ask is, what is the price of our silence? Because that is just something you have to marinate in a bit before you make a decision.
What does that mean? What's the price of our silence? I mean, when you think about some of I imagine how this plays out in practice over things like don't say gay or abortion or conversations, we're having in Texas around the abortion pill, for example. How do you all put that through the sort of what is the cost of silence?
It's probably the most subjective of the 5 questions. Certainly, acts of racism would qualify. Acts of violence in the world or against the company. It's one that you have to bring years of experience to bear. And it's kind of a question I keep in there to allow for that and not to be locked into our metrics.
You just mentioned George Floyd as an instance where Pfizer did speak up, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Tell me what that messaging looked like and how integral you were to crafting it.
So, I mean, this was a horrific event. It was witnessed by so many people. I mean, we were still mostly locked down, which I think was part of what made the response to George Floyd as robust as it was, is people were paying attention to the news and in a bit way more quiet. And we started by having a series of conversations with our Pfizer Black colleague group. And I remember being given a script for that conversation. There were 3 executives that were asked to speak with the Pfizer Black colleague group. And I couldn't get comfortable with the speech or the talking points because they felt like talking points. And so a member of my team, a very senior African-American woman, told me to rip them up and just speak from the heart, say how I felt, and ask questions. And so that led to a better dialogue. And yes, we did put something on our website, expressing our abhorrence at what we had witnessed. But it wasn't as important to me as being there for safe space conversations with our own colleagues.
It's wonderful. You write a bit in Breaking Through about cancel culture. You say, I think the direct quote is, "When cancel culture fever rises, no one is safe." You write about experiencing a little bit of this yourself when you went to work for, quote, big pharma. I'm curious what that was like. You even write a little bit about what it was like engaging with your friends when that happened, and sort of what you learned from that experience about empathy and about kindness, which are two values you write about a lot in your book.
Right. So cancel culture and working in big pharma are two related but not identical topics, and I can quickly address them both. In terms of working in big pharma, as I said, I'd worked in government and in other companies, and when I was called about a potential position at Pfizer, I realized that these companies make life-saving medicine, and they're poorly regarded in society. And I thought, that's ridiculous. I'm going to fix that. I'm going to go there and fix that. It might take me a year or two, but I'm pretty good at what I do, and I'll make that happen. I spent more than 10 years working on that, and I understood the problem more deeply. I did research, polling, focus groups, and I had a deeper and more nuanced understanding of why people have the feelings they do and how important access is to medicine for everybody. But it really wasn't until the pandemic when we had a chance to prove our best selves. And so I'm glad I went to Pfizer. I'm proud to work there. And we now have to live up to our new reputation, and that's a good challenge. So that's the big pharma piece. On the cancel culture piece, I'll probably say something that will get me canceled. But I think it's important that people are called out if they do the wrong thing. And I think many people call out people because they're trying to make the world a better place, and often people need to be called out. But I also think, I like the quote by Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Institute, that we are not the worst thing we ever did. And I think that redemption is important, and growth and learning and mercy and kindness are also important too. And I think as a people and as a society, we can do both. We can have anger and protest and upset, and growth and learning and charity and kindness.
Thank you. So, Sally, in your book, you write about your own, probably your own toughest personal communication story about figuring out how to come out to your parents at a time when the world was far less accepting than it is now. I know that your wife is in this room, and we're thrilled to have her here as well. You wrote about having the courage and letting candor be your lifeblood. How did that experience, first of all, tell us a little bit about how it went, because now we want to know, and also how that sort of helped govern or guide your professional comms strategy.
Okay, thank you. I feel sometimes embarrassed these days to tell the coming out story because people are like, so what, big deal, who cares? But if you go back to the early 1980s, this is before Ellen DeGeneres and before all these things, and it was a big deal, and I was very frightened to tell my parents that I was gay. I knew I needed to because I love my parents and I want to have a good relationship with them. But I knew that as liberal as they were, it didn't extend to this. So I went home I practiced what I was going to say in the mirror. I tried to arrange my face into a positive look, and I wasn't kidding anybody. I was scared, and it was going to be tough. I went home, we had dinner, and my parents were like, well, you said you came home to tell us something. What do you want to tell us? And after a long preamble about how much I love them and how important they are to me, I sort of spat it out that I was gay. And the response was what I feared. My mom was furious. My dad was crying. And through his tears, my dad said to me, "You will never have a spouse, a child, or a career." And he said those things were hurtful, but he didn't mean them to be hurtful so much as he was expressing his own anxiety as a parent at the time. And it was in that moment that my life plan crystallized, that those were the three things I had to have. And I am very fortunate to have my loving wife of 35 years. I have a brilliant and beautiful, amazing daughter, and the job is going pretty good. I just want to add, if I may, a thing or two. One is that I really encourage anyone in the room who might be thinking about sharing something hard to do it. In exchange for the short-term pain, you get a long-term gain of pride and peace in your life, whatever it is. The other thing I want to say is I have to give a call out to Jim Weiss, because this man is an ally like no other I have ever met and has supported LGBTQ plus people in his company and around the world. So Jim, thank you. Stand up. And you're doing great work in this space too.
I've been moderating South by panels for probably 15 years, and this is the first time I've cried on stage. So, so Sally, you write in your book that most of your communications mistakes have happened when you rush to act without stopping for reflection. Now I'm going to ask you to tell us about a time when you screwed up, when you made a mistake by rushing in.
Okay, I could tell many stories on this, but I will...
Pick the juiciest one.
Okay, so the juiciest one was when I was working for the Estee Lauder companies, and my job was to call journalists and get them to write great stories about the Lauder family, the Lauder company, the products. And so usually I would call journalists and try my best to encourage them. One day they called me, 2 journalists from the Wall Street Journal. And they started flattering me.
Oh, boy.
Okay, they asked me about my brilliant career, how did you achieve so much? And I just fell into this trap. And I started talking before I was thinking. And they said, "Oh, we heard you gave a great speech somewhere, but that funny thing happened. You were wearing a pointy shoe, and you were struck down with a toe cramp." Okay, and when they asked me that question, I realized it was too late. I had already started to tell this ridiculously stupid story about a toe cramp and ended up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about women and high pointy shoes and toe cramps, and I was so mortified and so ashamed that here I was, the person who's supposed to be an expert, and supposed to be advising Aaron Lauder and Mrs. Estee Lauder and all these things. And I can't even do this for myself. So I went to the office the next day, and maybe some of you have had this experience where nobody looks at you in the office. They just look down, and the doors are closed in the hallway. And so I went in my office, and I read the article again. I threw it in my trash bin. And I just sat at my desk basically feeling nauseous through the day. When about 4 or 5 o'clock, I got a phone call from Leonard Lauder, the chairman and CEO. And I thought, well, that's it. I'm out. It was nice. And he said to me, what that actually wrote in the Wall Street Journal is, standing, statuesque, and pretty in her outfit, Sally Susman started her speech until she was struck down with her toe cramp and had to hobble from the stage. So Leonard said to me, Well, they said you were statuesque and beautiful. Okay. And I will never forget that, because anybody who works out in the public space, like many of you do, will have mistakes, and you will make errors. Mine, I know, come when I move too fast. You should think about, when do your errors come, and try to avoid them. But really, Leonard's kindness and generosity and forgiveness meant the world to me. I would also like to say, I have never worn a pointy-toe shoe since then. Yeah.
Yes, I was going to say, that seems like the moral of the story. Yes.
Well, you know, if Kamala Harris can campaign for president in sneakers, I think the rest of us can wear them too.
Absolutely. Well, talk a little bit about the power of pause. So when you talk about this story about the pointy-toed shoes in your book, you also write about the power of taking a breath. And all of us, we operate in this, breathless environment. I mean, we were talking about journalists calling and saying, I need an answer in 30 minutes. We try to be a little better and say, like, I need an answer in 60 minutes. But it's still pretty quick often. Yeah. And so how do you, in practice, make space for that when we have demanding bosses and a lot of people we're trying to serve?
Right. So I want to say a couple things about the pause, because it's something I really believe in and advocate for. When I write speeches for executives, I mean, usually I'm the one behind the curtain. It's very rare for me to be in the front of the curtain.
And isn't she doing great?
I would put a light comment in the speech, and then I would put in brackets, pause for laughter. Because, sometimes when people are giving speeches that have been prepared for them, they just blast through it. And so they say something funny, and nobody even heard it. Or they say something profound, but they don't wait. And it's in that little pause where you're showing the confidence of what you're saying, you're showing the confidence of your conviction. And I've been studying the pause. And if you notice, in all fields, before a golfer takes a swing, before a concert pianist strikes the keys, real experts will take a pause. So I'm all for the pause.
Mm-hmm. It works for the journalists in the room too. Our tactic is when you pause, then people say things, they try to fill the space. And so
I write about that too.
Yep, you sometimes get your best answer.
I tell people, don't fall for that.
Yes.
Just finish your statement. And part of being comfortable in the pause is, you ask me a tough question, I give you my answer, I stop, you don't say anything, and don't make the fatal mistake of just rambling, because that's bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, I want to talk about COVID. COVID obviously presented real risks, but also real rewards for Pfizer from a reputation standpoint. There was, if you got the vaccine right and fast, it would have been, you saved the world. And if it didn't work, obviously the alternate might be the messaging. So how were you not sort of paralyzed by fear?
Well, here I want to give a lot of credit to my boss, Albert Bourla. And if you know him, please tell him I gave him all the credit. He really deserves it. He's a great leader. And when, in March of 2020, so just about 3 years ago to now, he went to give a speech in Greece. And by the time he landed, Greece had locked down, and he couldn't give his speech. And so he came home, back to New York, and he had the time on the plane to think. And during that time, he wrote a note, and I have a copy of it, and it's in his book, Moonshot, where he says, I need to do three things. One, take care of our 85,000 employees around the world. Two, make sure the steady stream of medicine gets to people, because cancer didn't stop during the pandemic. Other dreaded diseases didn't stop. And I just want to mention that when the rest of the world's supply chain broke down, and you couldn't get a refrigerator, and you couldn't get a car, you could still get medicine, and the medical supply chain held up. But the third thing he said is, we're going to bring a vaccine forward by the end of the year. And here I was like, oh my goodness, I'm in the middle of a global pandemic, and my boss has lost his mind. He's just, this is impossible. It takes 10 to 12 years to make a vaccine. But he said it, and he said it publicly. And then we started to work.
Did he tell you before he said that publicly?
No. I think, he's a very smart guy. I think that was, part of the magic of what he was doing. You know, he gave us something we had to publicly live up to. And he did something very important because he needed to assign a project manager for the creation of the COVID-19 vaccine. And he assigned himself, which rarely happens in corporate America. It's usually, you know, give it to the manufacturing guy or give it to the scientist. And he had regular meetings several times a week where everybody who was involved was on one Zoom. And that's not how corporations usually work either. Usually the senior people tell the next senior people who tell the next senior people, and before you know it, nobody knows who's doing what or who said what, and it's not happening. And so we went on this journey, to use your word, to do this, and basically instead of creating a linear process, we did everything at once. We bought the raw material, not knowing if it would work. You know, we reconfigured our factory lines, not knowing if it would work. And I thought to myself, my job is to make sure the world has confidence in this vaccine. And let's be candid, you know, some do and some don't. So I wasn't uniformly successful here, but I took some big risks. And probably the biggest one was I embedded some media with us in the journey.
That's always terrifying.
Terrifying. It's so scary. And so we had the Wall Street Journal with us. We had Nat Geo, because they're documentary filmmakers with science background. And they filmed for those whole 8 months. They went into the factory. They went into the lab. They had long conversations with our executives. And they wanted to be with us the day we found out whether or not the vaccine worked. And I was like, oh, no, it's too much. But then I thought, it's too late. You know, they've already been filming us. I should have thought of this sooner. What if I'm filming the biggest failure in corporate history? And then I thought, if we fail, to your point, we're going to have a bigger problem than a bad documentary.
Right.
We probably might not even be here today. So they captured the moment in which we were elated. The movie called Mission Possible, the documentary is available on YouTube. And I feel in my role, I'm the chief documentarian of the company. And I made that film for the 85,000 people who work at Pfizer because it is the story of our professional lives. And we will tell it to anyone who will listen to it multiple times. So, you know, it was worth it, though, to take these risks and to try to be more forthcoming with the public at a time when we were doing new things, using new technology, engaging with a frightened public. It was just one of many things we did differently at that time.
You mentioned the frightened public, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how we think as a society about sort of fact and truth around vaccines. Obviously, the anti-vaxxer movement was huge. You know, it continues to be a big challenge. We've got marginalized communities that were concerned for good reason about the safety of vaccines, given their history. What is a pharmaceutical company's responsibility? What's the comms strategy for grappling with those kinds of issues?
Well, I mean, during what we all lived through, the greatest pandemic of a century, we couldn't do anything by the way with the book. I mean, there wasn't a comm strategy like we normally have a comm strategy. And I see it now in hindsight. I didn't have the words for it in the time, but I basically decided that my CEO and our chief scientist and my company needed to be the educator-in-chief for basically the world. And so, you know, we were leading the news every night. We were a company that had existed a lot in the bunker in the past. We were making ourselves available 24/7 and really trying to be more than just a commercial entity with a comms strategy. So, for example, we made a television commercial, and the commercial is called "Science Will Win." And it was about that science would win. Not that Pfizer would win, but that science would win. We, you know, did many things in this regard to help educate, and particularly educating around the vaccine. I started by thinking that data would win the day. You know, we'll have 95.6% efficacy, and we'll show that we had 30 to 40,000 people in clinical trials. But that's really not the way it worked. What worked was old-fashioned storytelling and not by celebrities and politicians and famous people, but by the preacher, the teacher, the barber, the neighbor. And the stories would be things like, I saw my grandkid because now I'm vaccinated, I'm safe enough to see my grandkid. Or I want to help my son get back to college. And these stories were really very meaningful. And so I learned a lot in the process. The last thing I want to say about this particular element is I don't use the phrase anti-vaxxer. I think it's aggressive and not unhelpful in trying to convince somebody or understand why they don't have confidence. And so I've tried to sort of banish that term.
What do you use? Vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah, or people who don't have, who for, as you say, may be good reason, because maybe the health ecosystem hasn't treated them fairly or respectfully. You know, so people who are vaccine hesitant, that kind of thing.
One more question on sort of this topic. I mean, I think you write a little bit about how, you know, there was a temptation for some drug companies to sort of go after each other and say, you know, whose was going to be ready first, whose was most, you know, had the highest efficacy, for example. When you all were strategizing on your messaging, how did you and why did you stay out of that fray?
Along with the phrase, science will win, our other mantra was, the only enemy is the virus. Okay, I didn't like the racist finger pointing that happened around the pandemic. And it, you know, look, the pharmaceutical industry, like every industry, is super competitive, and in regular times we throw elbows at each other, but we couldn't do that now. Pfizer issued a pledge to be cooperative with our colleagues in the industry. There were times when we had excess capacity that we let other companies use our capacity. But the big moment was when the race to the vaccine was getting very politicized. And people were saying that the FDA wasn't doing its job, or that, you know, this was going to be timed around the election, or other things that were utterly ludicrous. So over the course of a weekend, several of the CEOs, my CEO, Alex Gorski, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, other leaders, they came together and drafted a pledge. And the pledge said that nobody would cut corners, nobody would submit for their FDA approval for emergency use ahead of the full completion of their trial. You know, we made these very public commitments, and then all the CEOs signed this document, and then we put it in the newspaper. And then one more thing happened. And I have to give credit to Real Chemistry for this. They did something called a virtual handshake or something like that. I don't even understand it. But basically, they shipped this idea around so that it was announced on social media by one company and then announced by the next company. And we created this kind of rolling thunder in social media around this idea. And so it was a great moment.
Amazing. Sally, ultimately you wrote Breaking Through to help all of us sort of break through the noise and the clutter, to more deeply connect with each other in really divided times. What are some actionable things that those of us in this room can do to better communicate and also to help open minds and move hearts?
Thanks, Emily. I did write it not because it's not about public relations. It's about leadership and helping people, as I've tried to help them over the course of my career, to achieve whatever goal they want to achieve, to break through in whatever way they want to break through. And I also wrote the book as 10 simple ideas. There are 10 principles in there. And you don't have to read the book from start to finish. You can open it up and say, I'm interested in the chapter on pitch, I'm interested in the chapter on curiosity, I'm interested in the chapter on reflection, but I'm not interested in these other chapters. Because what I firmly believe is the best communication style is the one that's right for you. And so I hope that readers will, you know, browse through the book and pick the one that resonates with them. And I've tried to, each chapter has a personal story, then a story of people I admire, and then some basic takeaways. So I tried to make it user-friendly.
Well, Sally, thank you so much for bringing all of those values to us today, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much. Thank you.